Call of Duty Black Ops 4 Zombies is widely disliked by what seems like a large portion of the Call of Duty Zombies community. Many of the issues that players have with the game stem from changes to fundamental gameplay systems, like points, perks, pack-a-punch, etc. Several aspects of player movement were also changed in Black Ops 4, and I want to shed light on changes which I thought added to the gameplay experience, as well as changes which I thought took away from the gameplay experience. Like Black Ops 3, there are a lot of mechanics that need to be looked at in this game, so be prepared for another long video. As always, relative movement speed calculations are very important for quantitatively evaluating player speeds for different movement methods. Relative movement speeds for this game were calculated by dividing the time it took to walk with the Welling starting pistol across a specific route on the map by the time it took to traverse the same route with other weapons and/or other movement methods. Time measurements were gathered to perform many of the calculations for characterizing movement speeds and other movement mechanics. Since footage for the tests were recorded in 60 FPS and average values were calculated from 3 or more time values, average time measurements are generally subject to an error of around 1/60th of a second, and relative movement speeds are generally subject to an error of about 1%. I will bring attention to any calculations or results which I believe may be subject to larger magnitudes of error or systematic error resulting from my testing methods. As mentioned in my previous video on movement mechanics, I will be discussing jump mechanics in a separate video due to the increased complexity in the measurement methods and analysis. That will likely be the next video I work on, so keep on the lookout for it. Footage for my testing is saved in separate videos, which will be uploaded alongside this one and linked in the description. The results of all my calculations are also included in a Google Sheets document, which is also linked in the description if you would like to look at or analyze the data for yourself. All the results discussed in this video were derived from tests ran on the zombie maps Blood of the Dead and Voyage of Despair. The Google Sheets document linked in the description briefly describes all the routes used for each test, and the videos containing the testing footage show all these routes. The first test I did was to compare the 100% movement speed in Black Ops 4 to that of its predecessors. In measuring the time it took to travel across the Warden's office, I was able to confirm that the 100% movement speeds in Black Ops 4 and Black Ops 2 were identical. For my results from the other player movement mechanics videos, I conclude that the 100% player walking speed is the same across all Treyarch Zombies installments. Moving on to how player walking speed varies with equipped weapon, I tested all non-wonder weapons available on Blood of the Dead and Voyage of Despair. I also tested the 2 shields as well as 8 specialist weapons. When I had collected all the data, I found that the best way to organize movement speeds was a tier system containing 8 distinct tiers. The extremely fast tier has 150% movement speed while walking, and this includes the Path of Sorrow specialist weapon, as well as the Stage 2 and Stage 3 version of the Chakrams of Vengeance. The very fast tier has 110% movement speed while walking, and this only includes the Ragnarok DG5. Weapons within the fast movement tier have 102% movement speed while walking, and these include the MP40 and the Switchblade X9. Weapons within the above average tier have 100% movement speed while walking, and these include the pistols, SMGs, shotguns, the ballistic knife, the Reaper C86, the Scepter of Ra, the Hammer of Valhalla, the Viper and Dragon, and the Stage 1 version of the Chakrams of Vengeance. The average movement tier has 97% movement speed while walking, and this includes the Vapor XKG and the S6 Stingray. Weapons within the below average tier have 95% movement speed while walking. This includes the rest of the ARs, tactical rifles, sniper rifles, and LMGs. Weapons within the slow tier have 90% movement speed while walking, and this includes the Helion Salvo and the shields. Finally, in the very slow tier, the Overkill and Hellfire specialist weapons have 80% movement speed while walking. Before jumping into my analysis of this tier system, there are 2 main issues that I would like to bring to attention. The walking speeds for the MP40 and Switchblade X9 were calculated at 102% movement speed. due to the possibility of error in my testing methods, I wanted to make clear that there exists the possibility that these weapons actually have movement speeds that are just in line with the other SMGs and not a movement speed that is higher. Similarly, the speeds for the Vapor XKG and S6 Stingray were calculated at 97% movement speed. These I determined to be accurate through extremely thorough testing, so I'm more confident that these actually exist in a separate tier than the other assault rifles and tactical rifles. Jumping into the results of the tier system itself, the Path of Sorrows and Chakrams of Vengeance, the Stage 2 and Stage 3 versions, get 150% movement speed while walking. As specialist weapons, these two have very limited attack ranges, so their high movement speeds are used to balance out their weakness. The Ragnarok DG5 has 110% movement speed while walking. Like the Path of Sorrows and Chakrams, it does not have very good ranged attacks. However, it can be used to revive down teammates and can be laid on the ground as a trap. As such, it was given higher movement speed than most weapons, but not as high of movement speed as the aforementioned specialist weapons. The fast movement tier consists of the Switchblade X9 and MP40, which have 102% movement speed while walking. Granted that my calculations are correct, I know that the Switchblade X9 has pretty weak damage per bullet, and the MP40 has a relatively slow rate of fire for an SMG. Additionally, the Switchblade X9 has no attachments which really help balance out its weak damage, and the MP40 cannot actually be equipped with attachments. As such, I think the increased movement speed is used to account for these weaknesses. The above average tier includes pistols, SMGs, shotguns, the ballistic knife, and Reaper C86. As for the pistols, SMGs, and shotguns, I think this placement is pretty reasonable, as it is consistent with previous titles. Personally, I find the Reaper C86 to be not a very useful weapon at all, even when equipped with attachments and upgraded. As such, I feel like it should have probably been given higher movement speed than these weapons, but I mean, you're not really going to be using this weapon anyway, so who really cares? In previous titles, the ballistic knife was in the 110% movement speed tier. However, in this game it only appears in the 100% movement speed tier. Normally I would take issue with this, but because of the fact that the electric burst modifier makes this weapon better than most wonder weapons, I think this is fine. I think keeping it in the 100% movement tier is actually good for balancing here. Also included in this tier are the Chaos Story specialist weapons, barring the Stage 2 and Stage 3 version of the Chakrams of Vengeance. Specialist weapons are meant to be powerful, so I personally think giving them this movement speed while walking is fine. None of them really stand out as absolutely broken in a certain aspect, so I don't really see a need to make any one specialist weapon slower than others. I mean, the Chakrams have poor range, but they get that mobility boost when they're upgraded. The hammer has poor range at the beginning, but gets good ranged attacks once you upgrade it to Stage 2 and Stage 3. The Scepter of Ra has really poor offensive capabilities, but possesses and then obtains excellent support capabilities. The Viper and Dragon have acceptable range and melee attacks to start, which just become more usable when upgraded, so none of them really stand out as incredibly broken. Moving on, the Vapor XKG and S6 Stingray have 97% movement speed while walking as opposed to the 95% movement speed typical of ARs and tactical rifles. I am not entirely sure why these guns get special treatment, as the Vapor XKG already has a nice niche as a discount bowie knife when equipped with the Bayonet Operator mod, and the S6 Stingray has pretty good ammo, damage per shot, and rate of fire in each burst. My best guess is that this movement speed buff comes from a balancing change made in multiplayer. So the ARs, tactical rifles, sniper rifles, and LMGs have 95% movement speed. These weapons generally have higher damage and more ammo than the pistols and SMGs, so it makes sense to give them slower walking speeds. Much like in Black Ops 3, we will see additional balancing measures rather than base walking speed used to balance the ammo and damage benefits of LMGs when compared to the tactical rifles and ARs. The only launcher in the game, as well as the shields, have 90% movement speed while walking, much like how it was in Black Ops 3. The Helion Salvo is essentially the best weapon in the game, so giving it lower movement speed than pretty much every other standard weapon is fine. Shields are also extremely powerful when combined with the Victorious Tortoise perk, so giving the player 90% movement speed while walking and holding a shield is very reasonable. The Overkill and Hellfire specialist weapons have very good ranged and close quarter combat capabilities from the get-go, so giving them 80% movement speed while walking is understandable. Overkill's ranged attacks and Hellfire's close quarter attacks are significantly improved when upgraded to future stages, so retaining low mobility is a good balancing tool for these when compared to the other Ether specialist weapons, being the Path of Sorrows and the Ragnarok GG5. One of the big movement mechanic changes in Black Ops 4 was the introduction of a half sprint speed, which activates once the player uses their full sprint duration. In previous games, the player was simply forced to walking after using their entire sprint duration. In Black Ops 4, they instead keep running, just at a slower pace. It should also be noted that full sprint duration will not recharge until the player stops sprinting altogether, meaning the player has to walk or stand still or something like that. In my testing, I found that the full sprint speed is 1.5 times faster than walking. I also found that the half sprint speed is 1.3 times faster than walking. I think that keeping the full sprint speed the same as it was in previous installments is perfectly fine, and having the half sprint speed be at least somewhat comparable is good as well. As a console player, I think the introduction of the half sprint speed is a good quality of life change. It means that we do not have to repeatedly press on the left stick every couple of seconds to reactivate our sprint when trying to travel long distances. So the main issue in testing sprint duration is that there isn't a clear indicator of when the player stops their full sprint speed. In previous games, the player was just forced into walking, with a very clear animation marking when the sprint would end. In Black Ops 4, the animation for player sprint is simply slowed down as the player is now moving at a slower speed. How I ended up testing this was by first counting the number of frames at 60 FPS to complete an entire cycle of the sprint animation while sprinting at full speed. Then I found a point in time, let's call it point H for example's sake, where I could notice that the half sprint speed had engaged. I then picked a moment in time before point H and counted the number of frames it took to complete one cycle of the sprint animation. If the number I calculated matched the number I had counted earlier, that meant that full sprint duration had not yet expired. By guessing and checking multiple times and with multiple different weapons, I was able to conclude that sprint duration with all weapons is somewhere between 8.25 and 8.33 seconds. I was not able to find any deviation from this model, even in anecdotal tests with the Path of Sorrows and Overkill. Since it was very difficult to determine when sprint duration ended, sprint recharge rates were also very difficult to test due to the presence of this new half sprint mechanic. I decided to test sprint recharge by measuring the time it took to sprint across a long distance with a pistol at full speed. For example's sake, let's say I measured 5 seconds. Then I would expend the rest of my sprint duration, wait for a period of time, then run the same route. If I got a time that was very close to 5 seconds, it meant that during the waiting period, at least 5 seconds of sprint were recharged. If I got a time that was a little bit longer, it meant that the waiting period had not fully recharged at least 5 seconds of sprint. I want to preface my results by saying that my findings are highly susceptible to measurement error, as being off by a frame or two when measuring the start and end time for the long distance run could have made a significant difference in deciding whether or not full sprint speed had expired. The smallest wait time, which resulted in completing the route without engaging the half sprint speed, yielded a sprint recharge rate of approximately 0.93 seconds of sprint charged for each second waited. This is a bit smaller than what I had concluded in previous installments, where 1 second of sprint would be charged for each second waited. I'm not entirely sure why this was altered at all, as I didn't think there was anything wrong with the old system. To observe the effects of Stamin-up on player movement, I tested player walk speed, full sprint speed, half sprint speed, sprint recharge rates, and sprint duration with multiple weapon types. I was able to draw 5 main conclusions from the data. Firstly, Stamin-up has no impact on walking speed. It never has, and Black Ops 4 is no different. Secondly, Stamin-up allows the player to move at 165% movement speed while sprinting at full speed, regardless of the equipped weapon. This is very much in line with Black Ops 1 and Black Ops 2, so no real surprises here. Thirdly, Stamin-up allows the player to move at 143% movement speed while sprinting at half speed, regardless of the equipped weapon. This makes sense because if you take the full sprint speed with Stamin-up, which is 165%, then you divide it by 1.5 and multiply it by 1.3, you get 143%. The fourth thing that I found was that Stamin-up has a negligible effect on sprint recharge rates, as I calculated a recharge rate of 0.92 seconds of sprint per second of waiting. This goes against the in-game description of Stamin-up, which states that it boosts stamina regeneration, which I assumed was the same as sprint recharge. The only way that the developers could truthfully say it boosts stamina regeneration is if stamina is defined by the distance the player travels and not the duration the player sprints for, as sprinting for 0.92 seconds at 165% speed would yield a greater travel distance than 0.93 seconds at 150% speed. Even so, that would really just be a very weird way of determining stamina in my opinion, so I think there's just a bug associated with Stamin-up or the description's just straight up wrong. Moving on, Stamin-up roughly doubles the player's sprint duration. In my testing, I found that the player can approximately sprint for around 16.66 seconds. I found this to be pretty unsurprising, as previous titles like Black Ops and Black Ops 2 had Stamin-up doubling the player's sprint duration as well. My main opinion on Stamin-up in this game is that it is a very useful perk for players who implement training strategies. Once the player surpasses round 50, super sprint zombies appear. These zombies move at approximately 115% movement speed, which means it is difficult to get away with them at half sprint with many ARs and LMGs. It is nearly impossible with shields and the healing on salvo. As such, Stamin-up is really a must-have for high rounds where the player attempts to train zombies. For players who use camping strategies, Stamin-up is generally pretty useless. The only time it might be useful would be when the player must buy ammo or grab a new shield, resulting in them leaving their camping spots. So Black Ops 3's knee slide mechanic saw the creation of slide chain, where the player could slide, jump, then slide again, and repeat this process over and over in order to move very quickly around the map with very few limitations. In theory, an extremely skilled player could slide chain to traverse the entirety of most maps. In Black Ops 3, I estimated the speed with which a player could slide chain to be approximately 170% movement speed. Flash forward to Black Ops 4, where significant limitations were put on the knee slide mechanic in order to prevent players from performing this trick. Slide speeds were slower, and repeated slides and jumps resulted in slower speeds, to the point where doing so would actually be detrimental to the player. In my experience, slide chaining can really only be performed successfully 2 to 4 times in a row. After that, the player starts moving at speeds which are slower than just sprinting. In my testing, in an area of Blood of the Dead where the player can chain 2 slides together, I calculated movement speeds between 152 and 157% without Stamin-up, and between 154% and 157% with Stamin-up. This indicates that slide chaining is incredibly useful when the player is forced into their half sprint speed, regardless of whether they have Stamin-up or not, as 154 or 157% movement speed is faster than any half sprint speed you will generally see. If the player has full sprint duration and is not using Stamin-up, it is also very useful. If the player is using Stamin-up and can full sprint, or simply has Stamin-up in their modifier slot, slide chaining is pretty much useless in this game. I dislike the fact that slide chaining is pretty significantly nerfed in this game, as doing so reduced the player's arsenal of movement options to just sprinting. While I appreciate that sprint durations were buffed and that a half sprint speed exists, I thought that slide chaining brought an interesting element of skill into the game, which rewarded high skill players with an extremely fast movement option. In Black Ops 4, it is simply a tool which provides only a slight benefit most of the time, and is more difficult to execute properly. As per usual, I found that player walking speeds are multiplied by a 0.66 multiplier when crouched. However, this does not apply when the player is equipped with the Path of Sorrows. A multiplier of 0.80 is implied instead. I do not understand why this was done at all, but who crouches when using the Path of Sorrows anyway? It's a very weird observation, which leads me to believe that it's probably a bug. This is backed by the fact that the Chakrams of Vengeance, the Stage 2 and Stage 3 versions, are still affected by a 0.66 multiplier as all other weapons. Crawling causes the player to move at a speed that is 0.17 times the speed they would move if they were walking while standing up. Not exactly sure why the developers keep changing the crawl speed, but this is once again pretty insignificant, since even most crawling zombies can outrun a player who is crawling while prone. Voyage of Despair and Tag der Toten feature areas where the player can swim underwater. These areas in Voyage can be drained, meaning that the player can swim across the same path that they can also walk across when the area is drained. As such, I was able to calculate player movement speeds while swimming and fast swimming. My main findings are as follows. Firstly, normal swimming has a movement speed of 75%. Next, fast swimming has a movement speed of 120%. And then finally, swim speed is unaffected by the equipped weapon and is also unaffected by stamina. I found it interesting that yet again, the fast swim speed was not equal to the normal swim speed multiplied by 1.5. However, in this game it's actually faster. I don't think systematic error was the cause of this observation, as I started my timer when the player started moving forward rather than looking for the player animation to start. If anything, this would cause me to calculate slower speeds. The result doesn't really make much sense to me, but who am I to complain about having faster movement in a game mode I enjoy? The Blaze Phase perk works in a similar way as the Rocket Shield did in Black Ops 3. Instead of simply pressing the right trigger while holding out their shield to get a brief boost in speed, the player must crouch for a period of time and then uncrouch to rocket forward. Since the player boosts forward for only a short distance without the modifier, I had to use a short path on Blood of the Dead to measure movement speeds while flying forward. Since the player can fly for an infinite distance with the modifier, I was able to use a longer distance for evaluating the speed while boosting forward with the modifier. My speed measurements account for the time between the player uncrouching and the player colliding with a wall. For short distance tests, this means that the startup period where the player begins to uncrouch will take up more time relative to the player actually boosting forward, resulting in overall slower speed calculations. The movement speeds that I calculated for each level charge are as follows. For the small red charge, I calculated 328% movement speed. For the full red charge, I calculated 359% movement speed. For the modifier charge, calculated over a short distance, I calculated between 359 and 374% movement speed. However, for the full modifier charge across a long distance, I calculated a movement speed of 500%. Blaze Phase is not exactly practical for traversing maps, considering how long the player must actually remain crouched in order to charge up, and how short a distance a player can actually travel unless they're using the modifier. The only situation where Blaze Phase might be useful to the player for map traversal is if the player uses the blue modifier charge to traverse a long, straight pathway, like the length of the dining room on Voyage of Despair. When using the Quick Revive perk in the modifier slot, the player receives a movement speed boost when their health is regenerated. This speed boost results in player movement speed of 192%, regardless of the equipped weapon and regardless of whether the player has stamina. The only exceptions to this are the Path of Sorrows and the Chakrams of Vengeance, which by default have sprint speeds of 223%. These weapons receive no benefit from the Quick Revive modifier, and when sprinting with these weapons when your health is regenerating, the sprint speed is still going to be 223%. Black Ops 4 includes several features which impact the player walking speed while aiming down sight. The stock attachment returns from Black Ops 3, as does Always Done Swiftly. However, new attachments like Stock 2 and operator mods like Crossbar and Strobe Light also influence the ADS walking speed of the player. To most accurately depict ADS walking speeds, I decided to organize weapons by the resulting relative movement speed while aiming down sight. I thought it best to start with all weapons when not equipped with the stock. Weapons equipped with unique operator mods will be listed separately from the base weapon. Starting from the top, the Crossbar and Strobe Light operator mods prevent the Hades and SG-12 from fully aiming down sight. This means that their walking speeds while aiming down sight are simply equivalent to their normal walking speeds. I think this is fine, as these weapons do not truly receive the benefit of true ADS. Moving on to the pistols, it makes sense for them to have faster movement speeds while aiming down sight than the other weapons due to their weaknesses of generally having low damage and small magazines. While pistols are actually very useful when equipped with the right attachments and or upgraded, they are generally discarded for more powerful weapons. As such, fast ADS walking speeds are used to encourage their use. The M1927, Escargot, and M1897 Trebuchet are all classic weapons, and as such cannot be equipped with attachments. All of these weapons consistently had average calculated times which were greater than or equal to 3 frames at 60 FPS, faster than the weapons in the 80% movement speed tier. As such, I thought it was fitting to include these weapons in a separate tier of their own. I think the slightly faster movement speed while aiming down sight is a small incentive to counteract their weakness in not being able to be equipped with attachments, but is not something that most players will actually notice in gameplay. The Reaver C86 and all other SMGs have 80% movement speed while walking and aiming down sight. This speed for SMGs is slower than pistols because pistols have smaller magazines and generally worse damage, but faster than most other weapons because SMGs have either smaller magazines or worse damage than the other weapons. The Reaver C86 is just not a very good weapon, so giving it SMG ADS walking speed is meant to encourage players to actually use it. Shotguns have 77% speed while walking and aiming down sight. Again, it is slower than SMGs and pistols because they possess very high damage per shot. The ADS walking speed is faster than other weapons because shotguns suffer severe damage drop-off at range. Shields occupy a very strange spot on this list, coming in with 55% movement speed while quote-unquote aiming down sight. On normal difficulty, the shield is an extremely useful tool for killing zombies even in the late rounds, as the ballistic shield can kill in just a few headshots with its built-in pistol, and the spectral shield can wipe a full 24 zombie horde with a fully charged key blast. Apollo's Will also deals good explosive damage in a small radius with each spear, which is also quite helpful. It's bizarre that they get better quote-unquote ADS walking speed than most weapons, as I would have just assumed that they would get 40% movement speed like everything else. The S6 Stingray has 46% movement speed while aiming down sight, unlike many of the other tactical rifles, which possess 43% movement speed while aiming down sight. This is likely implemented for the same reason that the S6 Stingray has higher base walking speeds than the other tactical rifles, though that reason is once again one that I do not quite understand. The S6 Stingray has good damage and rate of fire in each 2-round burst, though I'd think that such a boost in movement speed would be unnecessary. The non-DLC tactical rifles have 43% movement speed while aiming down sight, alongside the Vapor XKG. I believe the tactical rifles get better ADS walking speed than the ARs and sniper rifles because they don't have as large an ammo pool as most ARs or damage as high as the sniper rifles. So this increased ADS movement speed is one reason to maybe use a tactical rifle over these other 2 weapon classes. As for the Vapor XKG, I believe this increased ADS speed when compared to the other ARs mirrors its faster walking speed than the other ARs, similar to how the S6 Stingray has better movement speed than the other tactical rifles. All other weapons have 40% movement speed while aiming down sight, which has become a standard in each game from Black Ops to Black Ops 4. Of note, the M16 was likely given slower aiming down sight walking speed than the other tactical rifles because it had 40% movement speed while aiming down sight in previous Zombies installments. Besides the shields, S6 Stingray and Vapor XKG, I think overall the aiming down sight walking speeds for all of these weapons make sense. Weaker, low ammo weapons have higher mobility, high damage and high ammo count weapons appear further down. Moving on to the stock attachment, I would like to make note of a few things. Firstly, not all weapons can be equipped with the stock attachment, so only certain weapons will be specified in this section. Secondly, I do not have all weapons unlocked, which can be equipped with the stock. Gotta love those microtransactions, am I right? So the weapons that I don't have include the VMP, AN-94, Echo Hawk Dual Bore, S6 Stingray, M16, Javelina AA-50, and the Locust. Since I do not have these weapons, I will simply speculate as to what movement speeds I would expect these weapons to have while aiming down sight and moving with the stock. So starting off, the Mozu and Cap 45 are the only pistols which can be equipped with the stock. Considering that they have 85% ADS walking speed without the stock, giving them 100% ADS walking speed while equipped with the stock seems reasonable. The pump action and lever action shotguns, the MOG 12 and Argus, also have 100% ADS walking speed with the stock equipped. Since they have noticeably slower rates of fire than the other shotguns, giving these two very high ADS walking speeds with the stock also seems pretty reasonable. The SOG 9mm, MX9, and Switchblade are all SMGs which have 90% ADS walking speed when equipped with the stock. The Spitfire is also an SMG, but it only has 88% ADS walking speed when equipped with the stock. The Spitfire is given slower ADS walking speed likely to balance out the fact that it has the highest rate of fire out of all SMGs, which can be further increased with its operator mod. Of note, the ADS walking speeds for SMGs with the stock is slower in Black Ops 4 than it is in Black Ops 3. In Black Ops 3, when aiming down sight with the stock, the player could move with 100 to 104% movement speed. I think this change was likely to give pistols a slight edge over the SMGs, especially when equipped with the stock. If I had to guess the ADS walking speed for the VMP, I would suspect that it would have an ADS walking speed of around 90% to be in line with the majority of the SMGs. The Reaver C86 and Rampage shotgun also have 90% aiming down sight walking speed. The Reaver is just a bad weapon, so giving it any slower aiming down sight walking speed with the stock equipped would make it pretty much unusable. The Rampage has a slower aiming down sight walking speed with the stock than other shotguns to balance out its relatively fast rate of fire for a shotgun. With the stock equipped, the Vapor XKG, KN57, Grav, Peacekeeper, and SWAT RFT all have 70% aiming down sight walking speeds. The Tiger Shark LMG also have 70% ADS walking speeds. The ARs and LMGs in Black Ops 3 all had about 70% movement speed when equipped with the stock, so these results seem pretty reasonable to me. If I had to guess the ADS walking speeds for the Echo Hawk Dual Bore and AN-94 when equipped with the stock, I would suspect that they would have an ADS walking speed of 70% to be in line with the majority of the ARs. The ABR-223 and Vendetta both have 67% movement speed while aiming down sight with the stock attachment equipped. The Vendetta sniper rifle acts much like a tactical rifle, so it kinda makes sense to lump it in with the ABR-223. What I don't understand is why tactical rifles have higher ADS walking speeds than ARs when both are not equipped with the stock, but have slower ADS walking speeds than ARs when both are equipped with the stock. It really just does not make much sense to me at all, and I'm really not sure why they did this. If I had to guess the ADS walking speeds for the M16 and S6 Stingray when equipped with the stock, I would suspect that they would both have ADS walking speeds of 67% to be in line with the ABR-223. I know that the S6 Stingray has higher ADS walking speed than the other tactical rifles without the stock, but the same could be said about the Vapor XKG in comparison to the other ARs, and with the stock attachment it has the same ADS walking speed with all the other ARs. The Koshka and Outlaw sniper rifles have 64% ADS walking speed, as does the Maddox RFB. In multiplayer, the Maddox RFB was patched to have lower ADS walking speed with the stock attachment than the other ARs, as it was considered to be too strong in that mode. As such, I believe that balancing patch also applied to zombies, where the Maddox really isn't that much better than the other ARs, so it just kinda has this unnecessary nerf. As for sniper rifles, I believe that they get slower ADS walking speeds with the stock than most other weapons, because again, in multiplayer, these are very powerful weapons which can kill in one shot, where all other weapons kill in generally 4 to 5 shots, sometimes even more. If I had to guess the ADS walking speeds for the Locust and Javelina AA50 when equipped with the stock attachment, I would suspect that they would have an ADS walking speed of 64% to be in line with the other sniper rifles. Finally, the Titan LMG has 53% ADS walking speed when equipped with the stock. I honestly think this is fine, since it has such large magazines and better damage than most ARs. To my knowledge, only 7 weapons can be equipped with an improved stock, Stock 2. This stock provides an additional movement speed boost while aiming down sight at the cost of 2 attachment slots. Its impact on ADS walking speed is as follows. As you can see, the stock doesn't provide a massive benefit to the aiming down sight walking speed of most weapons when compared to the regular stock. However, it has other benefits, and we will discuss those later. Always Done Swiftly returns as a classic elixir. It once again eliminates the movement speed reduction for aiming down sight, which means the player's walking speed while aiming down sight is actually equivalent to the player's walking speed when not aiming down sight. This applies to all weapons except shields. The player cannot obtain even faster speeds by equipping stock attachments in conjunction with the Always Done Swiftly elixir, as they do not stack. All in all, Always Done Swiftly is extremely powerful for ARs, tactical rifles, sniper rifles, and LMGs, but mostly useless for SMGs, shotguns, and pistols because those weapons already have very fast aiming down sight walking speeds. Unfortunately, even if the player is using only classic elixirs in their game, there are other elixirs which are just generally better. Because of this, the player is generally better off just equipping a stock on weapons which are compatible with the stock attachment and utilizing the other better elixirs for the general gameplay. Shooting Slowdown returns from Black Ops 3, where the player has reduced movement speed while firing their weapon. This applies to hip firing the weapon as well as firing while aiming down sight, and the effect is different depending on the weapon as well as depending on the attachments equipped to that weapon. I tested this similarly to how I did in Black Ops 3, except I instead traversed short regions of the map on Blood of the Dead while firing the weapon across the entire route. Again, I could only truly test weapons capable of fall out of fire or semi-auto fire that could be easily spammed due to how this testing works. To best portray my findings on movement speed reduction while hip firing, I constructed this table comparing walking speeds while firing and not firing weapons. As you can see, walking speeds for pistols and SMGs are not slowed down while firing from the hip. High mobility is the main advantage that pistols and SMGs have over other weapons, so it makes sense from a balancing standpoint to ensure the mobility of these weapons is not diminished, especially so when firing the weapons. Of note, this rule excludes the Spitfire when equipped with its operator mod and the SOG 9mm. I'm confused why the SOG 9mm receives a slight reduction in movement speed since it isn't a particularly good weapon in zombies. On the other hand, the Spitfire with its operator mod has an insane rate of fire, so its reduced movement speed while firing actually makes a lot of sense. Movement speeds for shotguns are reduced to 93% movement speed while firing from the hip. The SG-12 and Rampage have pretty insane damage output, especially so when upgraded. They also have 100% walking speed, so this seems like a pretty reasonable slowdown in order for SMGs to have a slight edge over them in terms of mobility. Like in Black Ops 3, ARs have 90% movement speed while firing from the hip. Again, I feel like 90% movement speed while firing from the hip is pretty reasonable for ARs, as it allows the player to fire while moving away from a horde of zombies without losing too much ground. It makes them slower than SMGs and shotguns just enough, so that the player feels like it might be worthwhile to use an SMG or a shotgun over an AR. The Hades also has 90% movement speed while firing from the hip, but only when equipped with the Crossbar Operator mod. This operator mod has the big drawback of restricting player ADS, so I think giving the Hades good hipfire mobility is a fair trade-off. The Tiger Shark has a walking speed of 85% while firing from the hip. The Tiger Shark acts much like a hybrid of an LMG and an AR, so it has movement speed reduction that places it below ARs but above the other LMGs. As such, I think this is reasonable. The Titan and base Hades have hip-fire to movement speeds of 68%, while the Zweihander has 63% and the VKM 750 has 54%. The Titan and Hades have lower damage than the VKM and smaller base magazines than the Zweihander, which could be potential reasons why they have higher hip-fire mobility. The Zweihander cannot be equipped with attachments, so that is likely why it has better hip-fire mobility than the VKM 750. Moving along, to best portray my findings on movement speed reduction while firing while aiming down sight, I constructed this table comparing aiming down sight walking speeds when firing and not firing weapons, as well as the movement speeds while hip firing. Since the strobe light and crossbar operator mods do not allow the player to truly aim down sight, the movement speed reduction for the SG-12 and Hades when equipped with their operator mods while holding the ADS button is the same as when these weapons are being fired from the hip. This I think is fair because again, they do not get the true benefits of aiming down sight. Compared to aiming down sight walking speeds, the pistols suffer no walking speed penalties for firing while aiming down sight. Again, mobility is a huge selling point for these weapons, so this makes sense. Interestingly, I found that the M1927 has aiming down sight walking speed on par with pistols when firing, which would imply that firing the weapon actually increases the player's speed. I believe that I found this result either due to error on my behalf or to a bug in the game, where the ADS walking speed while firing really should have been on par with the SMGs instead of the pistols. I cannot confirm these suspicions, but I thought I would just make it known that that's what I think is actually going on here. For all other base SMGs, there's no ADS movement speed penalty while firing. Like pistols, mobility is a huge selling point. When equipped with the Wildfire Operator mod, the Spitfire aiming down sight walking speed is reduced to 67% movement speed while firing. This nerfed movement speed is obviously to balance out the insane rate of fire the Spitfire has with this operator mod. Interestingly, I calculated an ADS walking speed of 45% for the Vapor XKG when firing, which is faster than the 43% I calculated when it's not firing. Again, this could either be due to error on my part, or could be caused by a bug. The other ARs have 40% aiming down sight walking speed, regardless of whether or not the weapons are being fired. Again, this is consistent with Black Ops 3, but I still do not understand why there is a penalty for firing from the hip, but not for when firing and aiming down sight. The SG-12 and Rampage shotguns also have 40% aiming down sight walking speed while firing, which is also consistent with Black Ops 3. Again, this is likely to balance out their high damage per second that results from being semi-auto and full-auto shotguns. Though, again, I really don't find myself frequently aiming down sight with these weapons, which makes this a nerf which isn't particularly meaningful for a broad majority of players. The Hades and Tiger Shark have 35% aiming down sight walking speeds while being fired. This is a very minor change from their base aiming down sight walking speed of 40%, but I suppose this was done to give ARs a slight edge over them in terms of mobility. This is also remarkably less punishing than it is in Black Ops 3, as most LMGs have aiming down sight walking speeds below 20% when being fired. The ADS walking speeds for the Titan, Zweihander, and VKM are 23%, 17%, and 15% when being fired. These are much more like the penalty seen in Black Ops 3 for aiming down sight and firing with LMGs, and I think helps balance the fact that they have the same base walking speed as ARs, tactical rifles, and sniper rifles. When looking at the movement speed reduction while aiming down sight and firing with the stock attachment, I constructed this table to compare the aiming down sight movement speeds with the stock attachment when firing and not firing for specific weapons. The first finding was that aiming down sight walking speeds with the stock attachment for most pistols and SMGs are not affected by firing. The only exception to this is the Spitfire, which is slowed down from 88% to 85% when firing when not equipped with this operator mod, and is slowed down from 88% to 67% when firing and equipped with its operator mod. Again, this was done likely to balance its insane rate of fire and resulting high damage output. The Rampage Full Auto Shotgun has aiming down sight walking speeds reduced from 90% to 63% while firing. Similarly, most ARs and the Tiger Shark have their aiming down sight walking speeds reduced from 70% to 63% when firing. I think this is reasonable as the Rampage has extremely high damage output for a shotgun, and the ARs and Tiger Shark have either better damage or a better ammo pool than the SMGs. The Maddox RFB has slightly worse aiming down sight walking speeds than other ARs even when firing while equipped with the stock. This is again the result of the aforementioned patch in multiplayer. I think it's stupid that the patch also applied in zombies, but I really don't think it matters that much since people really aren't going out of their way to use this weapon in the first place. Finally, the Titan comes in at 40% aiming down sight walking speed while firing while equipped with the stock attachment. Being a relatively high damage weapon with large magazines and a large ammo pool, I think this is also pretty fair. I also constructed a table to compare aiming down sight movement speeds with the stock 2 attachment while firing and not firing. As you can see, the SOG 9mm sees a small reduction in aiming down sight movement speed while firing with the stock 2 attachment. Due to the possibility of error in my measurements, it very well could be no penalty at all, but I thought I would just mention that I saw a 2% difference in my calculated values. The Rampage sees its aiming down sight movement speed reduced from 100% to 75% while firing with the stock 2 attachment. Again, I don't commonly aim down sight with shotguns, so to me this isn't really anything to write home about. Choosing the stock 2 attachment over the regular stock for this weapon in particular comes down to whether the player really thinks they need 75% aiming down sight walking speed over 63% aiming down sight walking speed while firing. The Vapor XKG, Peacekeeper, and Tiger Shark aiming down sight walking speeds with the stock 2 attachment are relatively unaffected by firing, which is great. As such, a player may find that the stock 2 attachment is actually very useful for these weapons, since these weapons can only really be effectively used when aiming down sight. The Always Done Swiftly elixir works mostly the same as it did in Black Ops 3, where it causes aiming down sight walking speeds for weapons being fired to be equal to the hip-fire walking speeds for those same weapons. The table showing this is shown on screen right now. There are some deviations you will see in this table of about 2 or 3%, but those really could just be due to measurement error on my behalf. As I stated previously, Always Done Swiftly really provides a great benefit to ARs and LMGs and weapons of that nature, but not so much to shotguns, SMGs, and pistols. In Black Ops 3, there existed a gobblegum called firing on all cylinders, which allowed the player to fire their weapon while sprinting without any penalty to sprint speed. In Black Ops 4, this function was allocated to the Stamin-up perk modifier. In my testing, I was able to make 2 conclusions. Firstly, pistols and SMGs suffer no sprint speed penalty for firing while sprinting. However, firing any other weapon while sprinting results in the player moving at their half sprint speed rather than their full sprint speed. Since firing while sprinting is generally not very useful in zombies, since you generally want to be creating distance between you and the zombies, I don't see this change as a very big deal at all. It's annoying that you're slowed down, but it's ultimately pretty irrelevant. Black Ops 3 was the first zombies installment where the player could reload their weapon while sprinting. This could be done with no penalty to the player's sprint speed. In Black Ops 4, this feature returns, but reloading many weapons causes the player to move at reduced speed. In my testing, I found that sprinting at full speed with the Welling, M1927, M1897 Trebuchet, and Hitchcock M9 did not slow down the player's sprint speed. All other weapons I tested at full speed resulted in the player moving at their half sprint speed while reloading. However, when sprinting at only half speed, I saw player movement speeds reduced to a sprint speed which is approximately only 10% faster than the player walk speed. The only way to circumvent this mechanic is to have the Stamin-up perk modifier, which will allow the player to move at full sprint speed while reloading. Considering that zombies move at 115% movement speed starting at around round 50, this effectively means that if the player needs to reload a weapon, they will struggle to outpace the zombies if they are sprinting at full speed. If they can only run at half speed, they will not be able to outrun the zombies. If the player has full sprint speed and needs to reload a heavy weapon like the Helion Salvo, the resulting movement speed is 117%. If the player only has half sprint speed and needs to reload a light weapon such as an SMG, which has 100% movement speed while walking, the resulting movement speed is only 113%. This mechanic makes high rounds without some kind of camping strategy or without using Stamin-up literally impossible. I couldn't quite pinpoint what exactly it was about high rounds that I hated about this game until I figured this out. On its own, reduced movement speed while reloading is bad for the player as it slows down the gameplay experience. However, paired with an insanely fast zombie speed, the game becomes essentially unplayable past round 50 unless the player constructs their loadout in a very specific way. I have very mixed feelings about Black Ops 4's movement mechanics. I strongly dislike the fact that it seemed like many mechanics were altered to ultimately slow down player movement, such as slower sprinting while reloading and slower slide chain mechanics. However, I appreciate the changes which helped speed up gameplay, such as the increased full sprint duration as well as the implementation of a half sprint speed. As such, I'm very curious to see what other people think about Black Ops 4's movement mechanics. I'm also very curious to see what mechanics remain or are altered in the next installment, which comes out in roughly 2 weeks. With that being said, if you found this video helpful or at the very least interesting, I'd really appreciate a like, comment, and or subscribe. If you're interested in more live commentary or gameplay style content, feel free to also check out my Twitch channel at twitch.tv/spknhm, where I stream every Monday, Wednesday, Friday starting at around 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Thanks for checking out the video, thanks for staying to the end. Have a nice day, you guys, and I'll see you in the next one.